Alright, what is going on, gamers? Today is a beautiful day for a GMS2 tutorial. So I'm going to run you through making my personal favorite thing to make in GMS2, and probably the easiest thing to get started using the software, a 2D platformer. It's going to be pretty straightforward, and it's going to involve like really fundamental levels of programming, zero drawing, and whatever ingenuity you have in level design. So we're going to start by making a new project, so just click this big fat new button. We don't want to use drag and drop because we're not plebeians here, Katie. So we're going to use the GameMaker language option, click right here.
I'm going to have to edit a lot on this
And you're not going to have to edit anything, it's fine. We'll just get demonetized. So I'm going to leave this in whatever this is for right now. I'm going to call our project platformer underscore LJ19. You can call it whatever you want. So it's going to start us up in this big, beautiful blank workspace, and it's like just a great canvas for making things. But it doesn't really show you what to do to make anything. So I'm going to show you what to do to make things. First thing you really have to do to get started in GameMaker, even really before you create like objects, we want to make sprites for stuff. That's always the first thing I do. So go over here to this little sprites tab, right click on it, and press create sprite. It also gives you a little keyboard shortcut if you want to use that. First sprite I'm going to make is the sprite for the player. So I'm going to name it S player. It is generally good practice in GameMaker to name all of your sprites starting with a little lowercase s, just so that when you're trying to find sprites, when you type them into code later, you can type an S and all your sprites will come up. So generally good practice, name all your sprites starting with a lowercase s. So right now it's just a big blank image. Well, we don't want it to be a big blank image because we want to actually display something on the screen for the player. So I'm going to press edit image over there. By the way, if any of you have questions at any time, Jake is up there. He can come around and help you guys personally, or you can just ask me. Feel free. I'll be happy to help anyone. So will Jake. So I want to make my player something that will really pop on the screen. I'm going to pick this, this nice bright blue here. And click this fill tool over here, this little guy. And then just fill the, okay, that's too bright. I'm going to pick a slightly less bright blue. And then leave my fill tool selected. And oh, that's better. Okay. So you can make your sprite whatever color you want, but you can generally just fill the square with a color. All right, cool. I don't need this image editor anymore. So now I have a sprite for my player. Now I can go down here to objects. Right click on objects, press create objects. It also gives you a little keyboard shortcut, Alt-O. So now I want to make an object for the player sprite. I'm going to call it O player. So similar to the sprites, it generally is good practice to name all of your objects starting with a lowercase o so you can keep track of them. So now I can go over here, it pops this little window up for the player object. And right here it has a little box that says no sprite. Just left click on that little box, and that'll let you pick a sprite for it. So I'm going to pick the one that I just made for the player, S player. Cool. Now my object, yes? Oh.
I'll ask the question after.
Sure. So now my player object has a sprite that is just a 64 by 64 blue square. Cool.
Hey Nick.
What's up?
What is the difference between a sprite and an object?
Oh, wow. Thanks. Good question, Jake. So a sprite is really just an image that displays on your screen. The object is something that can actually run code, interact with things, and have like any sort of presence in the game. The sprite is really just an image that displays. The object is something that can actually interact with stuff. So you can assign an image to an object, and you can use the object to display the image on the screen and visualize how the image interacts with stuff. Cool. Is anyone following along doing okay? We're doing good? Awesome. So right now, if I go to my rooms, GameMaker starts you up in this little rooms tab with one room called room 0. So let's double click it and see what's in there. It's just a blank black background. Okay, fine. Well, for the sake of my sanity, I don't want the background to be pure black. So I can come right here and click on this background layer in the room, all the way on the left side of the screen. Go to this black bar and set a different color for my background. I'm going to pick a pretty dark gray. I just don't want it to be pure black. All right, cool. Now my background is this off black gray color. And now what I can do is, yes? Sure. So if you go, do you have the room 0 tab open?
On the right side.
So go over to rooms on the right side, and it should have a little drop down and have a room 0 created. So double click that and it'll open a room 0 tab. And you see the whole black background? Now on the left side of your screen, go to the layers over here, click on the background layer, and then right down here in about the middle of the left side of your screen, you should see a solid black bar. Left click on that and it'll bring up this nice little color editor tool. You can just pick whatever color you want. I picked an off black gray. All right, cool. So now I want to bring my player. Oh, there's another thing about the difference between players or objects and sprites. You can't drag sprites into the actual. Oh, by the way, this is important. You should go back to the instances layer before you try to drag objects into the room, because you cannot drag instances into a background. You can't put objects into a background layer. That's just for images and displays. So go to the instances layer of your room, and you will notice that you cannot drag sprites into the instance layer of your room. So sprites aren't able to be instances or interact with other instances. You can, however, drag objects into the room. So I'm going to take my little player object and drag him right into the middle of my screen. All right, amazing. So now if I run our little project here, click the little play button in the top left, you should see a gray background with a little blue square on it, or whatever color you chose. Is everyone following along at this point? Do you see a little square on your screen? Wild. So I'm gonna press a bunch of buttons. It doesn't move. It does nothing at this point. It's just a square on a gray background. So that's kind of useless. So let's make it do stuff. How do we make it do stuff? Well, you can do two things. You can go back to the workspace by clicking on this tab, or you can double click on your player object on the right side of the screen. So we need to add some events here for this to actually do anything. First thing I'm going to add is a create event. So you go to add event, click the little light bulb that says create, and it'll add this event here. Oh, I'm going to zoom in. So it starts off with these two comments that say you can describe what your code does. I don't really care. So we need to initialize some things, because the create event is basically functioning as initializing all of the variables and tools that the object needs right when you start. So these things are all lines of code that will run on the frame when the object is created in the room. It runs once and then never runs again. So we need to do a couple things here. We need to initialize some variables. The first one I'm going to add is walk speed. I'm going to set it to 5. This is going to determine how fast your character can move left and right. I'm going to add a variable that controls vertical speed, Y speed. I'm going to start it out at 0. And you need to add, at this point, if we're going to make a 2D platformer, it's useful to jump. So we want a jump speed. Call that 20. And then what the other thing that we have to initialize off the bat is a direction. And that will also start at 0. So these 4 variables control 4 things. Walk speed controls how fast the character is going to move left and right. Y speed initializes how fast it's moving vertically. Jump speed is going to determine how high a jump arc is. And then direction just determines whether or not the character is moving left or right. Since it starts off not moving, it starts at 0. All right, wild. So now that we have these ready to go, I'm going to zoom back out. You'll see that GameMaker gives you all these little warnings here. And all of them pretty much just say that these are only referenced once and they don't show up again. So it's like, why do you have these variables here? Well, I'm going to show you why we have these little variables here. By creating a new event, a step event. So in this step event, the first thing I'm going to add in a 2D platformer is left and right movement. I want our character to move left and right across the screen. So let's do that. The first thing I'm going to do, my phone would stay open, lol. So the first thing I'm going to do is assign like buttons on the keyboard that will move the character left and right. So I want the right direction to be keyboard, check. And the way you assign keys on keyboard in... Oh yeah, you're right. So the way you assign keys on a keyboard in GameMaker is you use ORD, and then open paren, and then put the key in quotes. So I want right to be on the D key because I'm not a psychopath. You can use the arrow keys if you want. I'll show you how to use the arrow keys in a second. But for now, I'm going to put movement on WASD. So what this line of code here is going to do is it's going to check movement inputs every frame, because that is the function of a step event. The lines of code in a step event will run once every single frame. So right now, all it's going to do is set a variable called right to true if the button D is pressed on the keyboard. Yes?
Does it need to be capitalized?
It doesn't. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. It just matters that the string matches a button on the keyboard. So now I'm going to do the same thing for left. Left equals keyboard check ord. And I'm going to put that one on A because I'm still not a psychopath. Oh yeah, also, in GML, the language that this is all programmed in, ending lines with semicolons is optional. I personally like doing it. If you like doing it, you can, but you don't have to. So now I've got these little warnings here that are telling me, oh, the variable left is only referenced once. That is because in my create event, I haven't initialized them anywhere. So since I want these things to be left and right movement control, I don't want the character to move left or right at the start of the game. I don't want them to move left or right without the player pressing anything. So I'm going to say in the create event, right equals false and left equals false. That way the character starts stationary and doesn't move without the player pressing any buttons. So now that I have these little variables that check whether or not buttons on the keyboard are pressed, I want to actually do something with those buttons. The game can the program can detect right now whether or not I've pressed A and D on the keyboard and set these variables right and left to true based on whether or not I do that. But I want to actually do something with them. So what am I going to do with them? I'm going to take a nice little if statement and say if right. And what I want to do is take the direction variable that I created in the create event, the dir, D-I-R, and set that equal to 1, indicating that the direction will be moving on the positive x-axis, which is to the right in GameMaker, if the right key on the keyboard is pressed. Sounds logical, right? Everyone following? Cool. So then I'm going to go down and I'm going to say if left. Can anyone guess what's coming next? I can guess what's coming next. x plus direction every single frame, I will just say, or instead of having it move in increments of walk speed, I will have it move in increments of direction. Because this is going to run walk speed number of times. So this is exactly the same as detecting collision in the vertical direction. You're just changing some variable names so that you're using horizontal movement code. So I can close that. Close that. Oh wait, I forgot some parentheses, didn't I? Unnecessary expression. It's because I forgot the equal sign. So has everyone who's following along gotten this collision detector for horizontal movement? So now, if I go back to my room 0 and I add a floor object here, I'll be able to run into it and not pass through it. But even though I can run into it without passing through it, I can still move back the other way. I can still jump over it and on top of it. I can still fall off of it and kill myself. So now I have a wall that I can run into horizontally, so I won't just fly through everything when I'm moving left to right. So this is fine, and this works if you're just making jumping puzzles. But I want to give my player some obstacles to pass on his way to this door. So I want to make something that will just that will just kill him as soon as he touches it, immediately. So I'm going to create a new sprite. I'm going to call it skill. I'm going to say edit image, and I'm going to fill it with red. Because red's a pretty evil color. And now I'm going to do the same thing we've done before. Go into objects, create object. Call this one okill. Yes, what's up?
Just use the code for collision for X.
Sure.
Because I'm still on the
So collision for X is right here. It's these lines.
Okay, right.
Good? Okay. So I'm going to give my kill object the kill sprite. And the only thing I want to do here is add a collision event with the player. So if the player runs into the kill object, same thing as if they fall off the screen, room, restart. So now if I add this little kill object in my first room, say I add it here, or in my second room, I can run through this door, and if I fall into the kill object, it will kill me and the room will restart. Shortcut. So let's say that this is fine for like a regular platformer, but I want to get like a little bit more advanced. So the last thing I'm going to do is I want to say that this door can only be entered after, yes, what's up?
If you go back to the code for kill object.
For kill object, sure. So in okill, you will have one event, and it is a collision event with oPlayer, and the only thing in there is room_restart. So let's say I only want this door to be openable after the player presses a button. This is actually super easy to do, and it adds a nice layer of depth to gameplay that makes games a lot more satisfying. So real quick, the last thing I'm going to do is add a button to this level to make sure that you can only go through the door once the button is pressed. So I'm going to create a little sprite for the button. I'm going to make it green. Green. Maybe not that green. No, you know what? That green.
Your background that green?
No, it's not that bright. I'll name it S button, buttom. And I'll add an object, button. And I'll give it the button sprite. So what I want to do is make sure that when the player runs into this, it registers that the button's pressed. So I'm going to say if it collides with the player, collision event player, pressed equals true. And I want to make sure that, it kind of looks like this button has been pressed. So I'm going to squish it down a little bit when the player steps on it. I'm going to say image y scale equals 0.15. Now I have this little warning here because the pressed variable is only referenced once. Thanks for reminding me, GMS2. We want to make sure that at the start of the level, it doesn't register the pressed variable as true right at the beginning, because we want to make sure the player has to press the button to continue. So we'll initialize pressed in a create event as false. So the only thing the button has is one create event with pressed equals false, and then a collision event with the player that has the two lines pressed equals true and image y scale equals 0.15. Did I have a question back there? The create code just sets the pressed variable to false. So that way it starts off false when the level begins. All right, cool. So now if I drag the button into the room, let's make it a little shorter than the player. You will notice, very kindly, that when I run over the button, it squishes in the wrong direction. It starts floating off the ground. Well, I don't want it to squish off, I don't want it to float off the ground. I want it to compress into the ground. So the reason that's happening is because if I go back to my button sprite under sprites, you see this little crosshair right there? That is determining where the sprite is scaled from. So it's starting from the top left, and that means if I change the image scale to be shorter, it's going to scale it that way. I don't want it to scale it that way. I want it to scale it up. So I'm going to start it from the bottom left. You can start it from bottom center or bottom right for this case because we're really only scaling it vertically. But you'll notice that if I start it from the bottom left and run the game again, it will press downwards, but it starts right in the middle of the character. So all I have to do is go back into the room editor and make sure that I drag it back onto the floor. So that's cool and all, but right now I can still walk through the door without pressing the button because nothing is checking whether or not the button is pressed here. So in order to check whether or not the button is pressed, I'm just going to say if o_button.pressed. This is a handy little feature about GameMaker. You can reference variables in another object by using object name .variable. So I'm going to reference the button's pressed variable by saying o_button.pressed. So now, if I run the level, there's my button. I can't walk through the door. It won't take me to the next level, but once I press the button, off I go. And then I can kill myself. Everyone's wildest dream here at Stevens. You might have to edit that one out.
I'm gonna save it for our own. It's good.
Okay. So. Sorry? Multiple what? So, if there's more than one button in one room, right now, if there's more than one button in one room, any instance of the button being pressed will open the door. You can get around that a couple of ways. You can have either multiple pressed variables, or you can have multiple button objects, and then check to see if every single one of them is pressed. You'd basically just be repeating the process.
There should be a way to track by object ID. Like
You can track by instance ID.
GameMaker creates instance IDs for every object. So.
You can track by instance ID. It's a little bit harder to do that, like if you're following your program or if someone else is editing your code. So I would recommend creating different objects for them if you have more than one button. So the last thing I want to do, now that the button is pressed, yes? The Y scale? Oh. So if you go to O button, when it's pressed, the code is image_y scale equals 0.15. I picked 0.15, you can pick whatever. It's just got to be less than 1, unless you want the button to get taller when you press it. And then in order to make sure it compresses the right way, you just go to the little button sprite and change, it should start at top left, so change top left to bottom left. Then it will actually compress, oh, I moved it. Then it will actually compress down the way you'd expect it to. So right now, this is all well and good, but there's no real indication of whether or not you can progress through the door. I want to make sure that the player has some sort of understanding of when the door is open, rather than just knowing that they press the button. So let's say I have multiple buttons or multiple conditions for the door being open. I want an indicator that displays to the player when the door is open. Yeah, what's up?
I was gonna say maybe you could like make it turn white.
I could make it turn white. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say create sprite s door open. And I'm going to fill this one with white. That's not the fill tool. So I'll make myself a white square. And then, so to go to my door, I want to say in a step event, so that it will check every frame whether or not the button has been pressed. If button dot pressed, and the way you can change the sprite of an object in GameMaker 2, the way you can change what image displays for it, is you can say sprite underscore index equals, and since I just created the s door open sprite, I'm going to set that equal to s door open. And that is going to change the sprite of the door when the button is pressed so that it displays as white instead of black. Sorry, I'll zoom in a little bit. So now if I run the program, I've got my player, I've got my door, it starts off black, I press the button, it turns white, indicating that it is open, I guess. Then I can walk through the door, and the game will crash because I'm terrible. Oh, it's because it... So, fun story about GameMaker step events. If you try to go to the next room and then check this button in the same frame, it won't know where the button is, so it'll crash. So what I want to do is make sure that when it's checking this for the button being pressed, it doesn't actually... I want to make sure that it goes to the next room before it checks if the button is pressed, basically. So instead of saying just if button.pressed, I'm going to say actually, the easiest thing for me to do will just be to cut this code out of a step event.
And put it into the collision. When the button is pressed, change the sprite index of the door at the same time.
I could do that. So that's a way to do it. I can delete the step event here now. I was going to add it to a begin step event.
That works too.
So just for the sake of displaying how a begin step event works and making sure it works the way I think it works, let's add a step event here, but instead of just saying regular step, let's say begin step. This will make sure that this code in the begin step event runs at the start of every frame, not in whatever order GameMaker kind of arbitrarily determines based on whatever instances are happening on the screen. It'll make sure that this code in a begin step event runs before everything else that's in a regular step event. So I want it to check before it moves to the next room, so it'll actually recognize that the button is there and won't crash my game. This should work. Hopefully. Oh, maybe not. Well, alternatively, instead of doing this, since I guess GameMaker doesn't want to do that, I'll delete this event. And I will follow the suggestion Jake gave me. And I will say that over here, when the player collides with the button, so back in the button object in the collision event, underneath image Y scale, I want to say O door dot sprite index equals S door open. This will effectively do the same thing. It just won't rely on a step event in the door object. It'll instead have everything related to the buttons being pressed and the door in this one variable. If you wanted to have it such that there were multiple buttons and they all controlled it, you could add checks here for every other button and change the door sprite accordingly. There's also, you could definitely do it in the door if you wanted to. I would have to figure out how, but now we're good. So it's 2:28. I've used like, what, 45 minutes?
It's alright. You just should care soon. So, like,
It should. So, is anyone who's following along having any questions? Does anyone want to know anything? Do you want to try anything? Play around with numbers, play around with stuff in GameMaker? Can we? We sure can. If you want to. There are definitely ways to do it. Alright, so I think I'm going to stop the recording now. Just gonna, before I stop the recording, actually, I'm just going to go run through one more time what this code is. I could add camera movement.
hey, babe. Yikes. Maybe the simple one would just be like, you port small, track on player.
I could. Do I want to do camera movement right now?
I'd recommend just stopping the recording. We can do stuff though.
Yeah,
Just stop it.
So-
You save my record.
I will save your hard drive. I'm sorry, Jake.